gentlemen, welcome to another episode of Let's Talk Comics. I'm Jim Viscardi, your host, and this is the podcast where we dive deep into the world of comics with the creative minds behind the books that we know and love. Big thank you for everyone who has supported the show, and if you are new to the show, let me give you a little bit of a TLDR on what this is about. I go one-on-one with some of your favorite creators in the business to talk about how they broke in, why they broke in, what it's like, what it takes to stay in the business, and what they've got coming up. All in all, it is a good time had by everybody. This is a show that you can find anywhere podcasts can be found, and the best way to support the show, if you listen to this episode, it's your first one, you really enjoyed it, tell someone about it. I would really appreciate that. If you loved the show so much, I would really appreciate if you went over to iTunes or Spotify, leave a 5-star rating, but take it a little step further. Leave a 5-star review. And if I read it on the air, which I plan to do moving forward at the end of the episodes, today's included, you will get a free Let's Talk Comics sticker. Who doesn't love free stuff? I know I do. All right. Today, I am thrilled to introduce a guest who is not just a writer, but a true creative in my opinion. He's someone who, I think I mentioned this in the show, I use this analogy, but is someone who more often than not, and I would say like he's got like a 98% success rate in doing this, puts more toys back into the toy box than he actually takes out. He has spent time in the DC universe, the Marvel universe. He basically rebuilt the Power Rangers franchise from the ground up and then took all of that experience and said, I'm going to do this myself, and created the creator-owned Massiveverse. Kyle Higgins has proven time and time again that he can find what makes characters human, what makes good superhero stories that fans connect with, and then straps a rocket on its back and just goes right into the stratosphere. For years, Kyle has been not only a prominent voice in the world of comics itself, but at Image Comics. He's done a number of creator-owned books over the course of his career, and how he's been able to balance that with some of the other work-for-hire stuff he takes on is really, really interesting. And it's one of the things that I love about this show, right? No two creator origin stories are the same. And I think whether you are someone who is trying to break in, whether you're an established pro listening to this, I think these conversations give a little bit to everyone that they can maybe take and try and implement themselves. Kyle has done so much to try to expand the idea of what comics can be. I think a lot of that is most evident in his book No One, which is also a part of the Massiveverse, where that's a book that not only is the comic book itself, but there are podcast episodes there. He has viral websites and news articles, and like really took the reading experience beyond the 32-page floppy. And it's one of those things that is really something to be commended. Obviously, we're going to talk a lot about Radiant Black. Radiant Black is the cornerstone of the Massiveverse and has been going on for a couple years now. Issue 31 comes out in February and is a bit of it's not a reset, it's not a reboot, but after the events of the Catalyst War the book is in a rebuild era, which I think is a great jumping on point for a bunch of new readers. It's a nice, if you've been away from the book for a little bit of a while, it's a great place to jump in. And so we're going to talk about where the characters are, including the result of a fan vote that he did to decide the fate of the book, which was putting a lot of trust into his readers' hands. And yeah, and there's a lot more to be had there. This is a beefy, meaty episode. I love talking to Kyle. Kyle always has some pretty cool, insightful things to say. So all of that to say, you've been waiting long enough. Are you ready? I'm ready. Let's talk comics. Kyle, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. And also welcome back to you. This What prompted the return of the wonderful Jim Viscardi and his wonderful podcast?
It's one of those things. It's something I've had in the back of my head and wanting to do, and it's weird. When I started comicbook.com, I wanted to do this, but I had so many other things that I needed to do in the startup for that I just did not have the time for it. But then as I got further into it, I broached the idea with some of the partners I had there in wanting to do the podcast, and they wanted it to be a comicbook.com podcast. And if it was that, and I knew that like the inevitable goal for Comic Book was to sell it, and I didn't want to have this be a part of that. It would have destroyed me a bit in a sense to have had to give it away and not have the opportunity to kind of bring it back. Could I have brought it back with a different title and whatever? Yeah, absolutely. But I had so much invested in what I had done that like I just didn't want to do it. And then when we sold Comic Book, and then it became further into a further part of the Paramount machine, and I just got super busy for it. And if I wanted to do it right, I wasn't going to be able to do it the way I wanted to. So
sure, when
I started at Image, it was one of Eric Stevenson's things that he wanted to do kind of pretty early on, in that like he's like, well, Image had a podcast for a little bit, and he liked the idea of it and wanted to do another one. And I basically said, why don't you just let me do my old one? And he was like, yeah, that sounds like a great idea. And so in the truest ethos of Image, right, the show's mine. But we do it at Image. And does that mean that like I'm only going to be talking to Image folks? I mean, look, predominantly, yeah. But like, here's the thing, right? And it's funny, like, folks who have listened to the show, I've mentioned it a few times in the intros or whatever. So many people that I've worked with over the course of my career are now doing big things at Image. And so it's so interesting because for me, where, before, we talk a lot about, their work for hire stuff and things like that, and that's stuff that we're going to get into today. It feels like it means more to me doing it now and doing it this way. And so I'm glad. I could not be more grateful for the response it's gotten for the comeback. It's done really well numbers wise, which is great. Like, we're consistently a top visual arts podcast, which is awesome. And then I think we should, as I get a few more of these in the can, break into being a top entertainment podcast, which is great. It just shows that there's a hunger for that. There are plenty of other phenomenal podcasts out there, and I have a ton of respect for everyone who does them. And so the fact that folks are spending an hour of their time with me when we drop one of these out means the world. So yeah, but it's so crazy because like we were just even talking a little bit beforehand on like you and I have known each other what feels like forever, in a sense. And in prepping for this, I think we must have initially crossed paths a little bit when you had doing some early stuff at Marvel when you were doing Supreme Power and things like that, where I think like we maybe got I think we worked a little bit there. But I remember talking to you because I was a really big fan of the stuff that you were doing with Gates of Gotham a million years ago.
Yeah.
And I remember in those early conversations that like your breaking into the business is a little different than most, in the sense that like you kind of hit the ground running and like went from a few one shots and things here and there to basically, getting a pretty big Batman spinoff book and then jumping right into Nightwing. So like, let's unpack that a little bit, because like
Sure.
I know, you're outside of comics, your other passion lies in filmmaking and things like that. And so what was the goal? Initially, like was it to get into this business? Did you kind of like fall into it in a sense?
Yeah, to some extent, I think that's kind of a fair statement. I mean, I've loved comic comic books my whole life,
Right.
and of course superhero comic books, but I also I really found comic books and superhero comic books because of my love of superheroes, and
Sure.
a lot of that love actually came from films and animated shows of the late 80s and 90s through the early 2000s. So I was born in 85, so the earliest thing I remember is the Ninja Turtles cartoon, which blew me away. I was a huge Ninja Turtles fan.
Right.
And then that led to, both discovering the live action movie and realizing this is very different than the cartoon. And then, oh, it comes from a comic book. Oh, there's this whole other world and whatnot. And then things like X-Men the Animated Series came out in 92, so I would have been 7, and that kind of was a huge game changer for me. And then Batman the Animated Series, certainly. And so I was aware that comic books were around, and my uncle had a bunch. And I think at that time he lived with us for a couple years. He's he's about 15 years older than me. And so there was stuff always around. And then as I got more into the cartoons and Tim Burton's Batman and Richard Donner's Superman were really huge for me. Mm-hmm. It just became kids don't know this, Jim, or don't remember if they weren't there. We didn't have half the amount of stuff that we have today as far as media and entertainment with regards to superheroes. And so anything you could find was a huge deal. So I was watching reruns of the Bill Bixby Incredible Hulk show and the Nicholas Hammond Spider-Man show, and of course the Adam West and Burt Ward Batman 60s show. And you get through that stuff pretty quick if you can even find it when it's on reruns on Sci-Fi Channel. But then it's okay, well, where do I get more of this? And then of course comics are the obvious answer, and it's go to the place where it starts,
Sure.
So I always, I was a really big comic book reader and buyer for many years. But I was also making little short films growing up with my dad and my sister. My dad was our cameraman, on a digital 8 or high 8. It was actually a high 8 camera back then.
Nice.
And so when it finally got time to go to college, I started at the University of Iowa, and then I transferred to Chapman University in Southern California to study film production. I was pretty obsessed by that point with movies and making movies, and I had been editing and doing post-production stuff since I was 16 or 17, and had taught myself, Adobe Premiere and After Effects and a lot of sound editing stuff and motion graphics, and I had taken classes in Photoshop and Illustrator, so I had this kind of this graphic design, a little bit of a graphic design background from some of that stuff. And actually I started my first, I guess you could say my very first job in comics when I was I would have been 17, I want to say. Mm-hmm. There's a small publisher based in south suburbs of Chicago where I grew up named Moonstone Books. Mm-hmm. And the owner is a good friend of mine to this day, Joe Gentile. And they had the rights to The Phantom then, and Kolchak, The Night Stalker, and they were doing that book. Do you remember that Fred Van Lente, Steve Ellis book, The Silencers?
Oh, yeah.
That was Moonstone. And so there was a Wizard World Chicago that summer, and Joe had this idea about making some trailers for the books. Okay. And so I went and basically got all the art assets from them, and I not only edited but then animated all these trailers for The Phantom and for all these books, and that was my first time doing something like that. It was really, even looking back on it, it was pretty ambitious. And so from there and some other projects I was doing in high school with big DVD authoring of I'm a huge sports guy as well, and our high school football team my senior year won state championship, and so I put together this 3-disc oversized box set, and was not only doing all the design on it but all the authoring and encoding, and then I was also doing all the special features, and then I was in homeroom, I was I was excused, and I would go to one of the offices at school, and they let me use the phone. And so I was like negotiating like IHSA contracts to become like an official vendor, so that we could actually sell this like legitimately and everything, and then had it and mass produced it and everything. So anyway, so by the time I get to Chapman and I'm going into film, and I make the decision really quickly that like by the time I'm ready to do my senior thesis film, I'm going to take a really, really big swing. And I want to do the type of thing that could be a calling card for me as a director coming out of college. And so this would have been, I made the movie called The League in 2007. We shot it and finished it in the fall of 2008. And it's a 30-minute superhero noir about the superhero labor union of 1960s Chicago. And it's shot entirely on film. There's a ton of visual effects, ton of green screen. It's a period film, costumes, fight choreography, stunt doubles, like the whole 9 yards. And it almost killed me many times over. But we finished it, and I put it online. And there was this illustrator, a cartoonist named Eric White, who was becoming a friend of mine. We met because I hired him to design all the characters for the movie, for the costumes, like up front. And by the time we finished the movie, we'd stayed in touch, and he really liked how it turned out. And he's like, "Do you have an agent?" And I'm like, "No, dude, I'm like 23. I just graduated college. I do not have an agent."
Graduated.
Like the movie's not even done yet. There's still green screen in it. And he goes, "Well," he's like, "San Diego Comic-Con is like next week, or maybe in a few weeks." He's like, "I've got an extra badge." He's like, "If you don't mind wearing a badge with my, at the time, his wife's name on it." And this was back when like San Diego didn't care about that like at all. Right. And he's like, "Come down, like I'll introduce you to some people. Bring copies of the movie on DVD." And so we I burned all these discs, and we had this like gorgeous cover and case art and everything we did for it. So it looked really sharp when you picked it up. Yep. And he was a man of his word. He walked me around that convention and introduced me to every single person he knew and teed me up to like give them a copy of my, at that time still unfinished, movie. And so when we ultimately finished it a few months later, he sent an email. I put it online. We built a nice website for it and everything. And he had told me, he's like, "When it's ready, I'll send out an email to everyone I know with a link to it and everything." And man of his word, again, I wake up, I go to bed at like probably 1 a.m. at that point, having uploaded the movie. Mm-hmm. I was on the West Coast, certainly, or obviously, but go to bed at 1 a.m., uploading the movie, give him a heads up over email. I wake up at 6:30, 7 a.m., and he's done it. He sent out this email and he BCC'd me on it, and he sent it out to like 200, 250 people. It was everyone he knew in film, TV, comics. And the first person to write back, or if not the first, he was in like the first 3, was Joe Quesada.
Oh, wow.
And Joe at that time was, as you know, the editor-in-chief of Marvel. Right. And he wrote back and said, he was so kind and encouraging. And he said, "Kyle, I get stuff sent to me all the time, and every once in a while I watch the videos, or I watch the things." Sure. And he's like, "I clicked play on this and I didn't turn it off." He's like, "I watched the whole thing." And he's like, "Your love of film and comics shows up in every frame. And if there's ever anything I can do for you, please let me know." He's like, "I've already sent this on to Marvel West Coast as well." I think he actually sent it to Feige.
That's amazing.
And so I'm sitting there in the morning and I'm thinking like, I've loved this medium my whole life.
Sure.
I never thought I could make comics, save for like a brief period in high school where I was, I've always drawn. So I was like drawing a lot, not at any sort of professional level. And I only ever wrote, so I would have material to like make movies of, right? Mm-hmm. But the League for me was me going, I don't know that I'll ever get a chance to actually direct a superhero movie. And so if I'm going to spend all of this time, money, and resources to take a really big swing, I want to go to the genre that really inspired me in the first place, and that was superheroes. And so fortunately that came across with Joe, right? And so I just took a chance and I wrote back and I said, if you're ever looking, first of all, I told him how much of a fan I was of him and his work, and I was. And I just figured, you know what, this looks like it's not even a door open. It's like a window cracked, and I'm just gonna take a shot. And I said, if you're ever looking for new writers, like, you know, you should let me know. And he wrote back pretty quickly and asked me what kind of stuff I was into and stories. And then he was like, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to send this film around to all my senior editorial staff. And let's see if anyone bites, if anyone really likes it and wants to kind of take you under their wing. And a few weeks later, Tom Brevoort emailed me. And I've told this before. I actually don't know if Tom liked the movie. He's never actually told me. He just emailed me. He's like, Kyle, you did a thing. Let's talk. And so I ended up pitching to Tom for about a year and a half, I want to say. And probably about 20 different. Yeah.
So I want to pause you there for a second, because so at this point you're still what? So you're still in like your mid 20s at this point, right? Doing this?
I was 20. 20s? I was 23. Yeah.
Oh wow. Okay. So where then do you kind of crash course the pitching process? Or was it just trial and error and let's see what works?
It was pretty much that.
Yeah.
I didn't know anyone. There were a few people who were comics pros that had seen the short, and I interacted with a little bit. Brubaker and I talked a little bit, and so Ed was always very supportive. But I was never like, I don't think I ever asked him like, how do you do this, or how do you pitch this, or anything like that. Right. There was a moment in that process of like, because it went on, like I said, for like a year and a half, and the thing that they tell you is like, well, Tom would say like, don't worry about characters, don't worry about like, just like, if it's a good story, we'll find a place for it. So I ended up pitching like 20 different stories, everything from like concepts to like fully broken kind of like outlines for one shots and things like that. And there would be things that he liked, but then he would say, okay, well, I forwarded it on to that character's editor. And it's like, well, they don't know me. Like, that's not gonna, right. Like, that's not gonna go anywhere. And so I basically kind of like figured out finally how to ask him in a way that he would actually tell me, like, what do you need? Like, what do you have holes for? What are you looking for? Right. And one of the things was a Captain America one shot. And I remember where I was, like Alex Siegel, who wrote The League with me, and we then went on to do Cowl together and Hadrian's Wall, both at Image, and some other Batman work together at DC. You know, I'd done this all on my own for 20-some whatever pitches, and we're in the car, and I mentioned this, and he's a huge World War II guy, and we just like came up with this concept on the spot, pitched that's what got approved. And I give him a hard time to this day. I was like, you came in like at the 1 yard line, and like, but that is very, very important. Like I couldn't get across the goal line, which, you know, kind of actually like, it's kind of like my career in a nutshell. I mean, as far as like why I work with the people I work with now, and the collaboration is so important to me. But yeah, it was definitely like, I don't know how to do this. I'm sure there are emails that I don't remember that I would probably be embarrassed by to look back on now. There was a time where, yeah, go ahead.
How much of how comics worked did you understand even at that point? Because obviously, as a fan, you know, you grow up and you read these things, and obviously, there's creators involved in whatever. Right. But like, how much of the behind the scenes aspect of it did you know, and what was it like? Kind of like I said, like your career feels like it's been a lot of trial by fire, right? Like just kind of throwing yourself into it and learning as you go.
I feel like I had a decent understanding of it. Okay. Not the finer points of it all, but you know, I was a really big I was a big reader. I was also like, you know, I read Wizard every month. Right. Like I knew their how they presented how the industry worked and things like that. But then I also, like, in 2006, I interned for the Donner's company, so Richard Donner and Lauren Schuler Donner. And Jeff Johns had been Dick's assistant years earlier. And so there were people there, in particular, like Derek Hoffman, who was still close with Jeff. And, I think Jeff and I crossed paths a few times during those years. So I would be like, Derek would help. He would tell me things that he knew or give me advice. And this was then before I ended up making the League even. But then like Eric White, Eric was someone who had, by that point, he'd been in the industry for years, and worked for Marvel and DC as well as creator-owned stuff. So I feel like there were people along the way that I met and like was able to kind of, ask questions of, and then ultimately, like what I did know for sure was that, because I went to some conventions, like that first San Diego was really, really like a big deal to me, just to see like how this all operated and everything. And
well, it's just so
I
crazy.
Think I ended up.
It's so much different now, even.
I mean, Breaking In Now is like a whole other. That's a whole other podcast that I would love to take it, because I don't actually, there's the stuff, and everyone says it like every 10 years it's very different, and very much feels like that, these days. So, but yeah, it was a bit, I would say a bit trial by fire,
So you get a bit of work under your belt, doing some one shots here and there. How does then you syncing up with Scott to do Gates of Gotham happen then?
So essentially, I did the one shot. We did the Captain America one shot, and then it was like, I mean, to your point about like how does it, trying to figure out how it all works. It's like, so we did it. It's like, okay, now what? Like, is there more? Like, can we do more? Like, do we keep pitching? What happens? And on the Marvel front, it was actually about a year. A year later, Tom reached out and offered us another one shot, a little longer this time, I think. And this was for the origin of the Vision, but told as like kind of an updated kind of, take. And we were working on that. And I think while we were doing that, I started following, I wanted to do something, bigger, something a little like longer.
Right.
And so I started following, Tom used to do a live journal or a form spring, I want to say, where he would like answer questions. And so I was following that because every once in a while he would, people would ask questions about like, are there any plans for character X or Y or Z?
Sure.
And I realized like, well, when Tom, part of the problem of this being an outsider is like, even if you pitch a really cool story, you're working off of status quos that are they're 6 months ahead of, because you're only just reading it right now, and that means it's been done for at a minimum 3 weeks, but at most, the way it's supposed to work, a couple months. And so it means that like they know where things are going, and so you end up pitching things. It's like, oh, we already have something like that, or we're going in a different direction, or we're doing that very kind of direction you're already riffing on. And so when I started to see Tom respond to like, well, this character, no, there's no plans for this. There's no, and I would look at that and go like, oh, okay, well, there's no plans for it. Would there be an interest maybe? And one of the questions was about Supreme Power, which was a book I loved. And he said that there were no plans for Supreme Power coming up. And so I reached out to him and I was like, hey, is there any shot that would be an interesting thing to you, is to do more? And he said that it could be. And so I pitched what became the Supreme Power miniseries I was doing. And while that was happening concurrently, that pitching and everything, I was going to C2E2, and we were working on a creator-owned version of the League, which again years later then became Cowl, with a different artist, and it was an artist that was represented by the same agent who represented the Captain America artist we worked with. Eduardo El Puente is his name. And Eduardo was like, well, where do we want to try to shop this to? And so he was introducing us to some people, and he's like, do you know anyone at DC? And I was like, I don't. And at that time, it's like they would have had, I think Wildstorm was Wildstorm, but like that Vertigo at DC proper would be like a really cool fit, if you could get in. And he's like, well, do you know Mike Martz? And I was like, the Batman group editor? No, I don't know Mike. He's like, well, do you want to meet him? He's an old friend of mine. And I was like, I mean, if that's not too much to ask, like that would be amazing. And
Sure.
so he sent this email introducing me to Mike, and Mike and I got drinks at C2E2 in Chicago, and then stayed in touch. And 3 or 4 months later, we had breakfast at San Diego, and I had let him know that like I got this miniseries approved. The Supreme Power miniseries was approved. And so then Mike was like, well, do you have any Batman ideas? And I was like, well, I always have Batman ideas. Like, that's like the gold. Are you kidding me? That's the dream. And then he reached out a few months later asking me to do these origins for a character named the Night Runner, who was going to be the French Algerian Batman of Paris. That was created by David Hine and actually Augustin Padilla in the Batman and Detective Comics annuals. So I wrote these 10-pagers that Trevor McCarthy drew, and Scott read them and really liked them. And I guess they were talking about doing a miniseries already for something else. And so then Scott and I just kind of became friends. And then one day, Trevor calls me out of nowhere, and he's like, hey, man, I got this weird thing. Like, I don't really know what to do. Like, can I get your advice? And I said, sure. And Scott had been talking about like trying to do like a Cassandra Cain miniseries. Okay. That was like the setup to this. So Trevor calls me and he's like, yeah, they want me to do this. Like, I don't know. It's like a Batman thing. Like it's history. It's like, I don't really know. I don't know what it is. They didn't have much. And I was like, okay, well, good luck with that. Like, you should do it. It's Batman. Like, if you need any help, like, I'm happy to talk through whatever. And a few hours later, Martz calls me, and I was working as a sound editor at the time in Hollywood. And so I take the call, and he goes, hey, man. He's like, how'd you like to do a Batman miniseries, historical Batman series? I was like, is this the thing that you called Trevor about? Because he's very confused. And he goes, yeah. And he goes, so it's called... So it's going to be I was like, is this the Cassandra Cain thing? He goes, well, she could be in it, but no, it's going to be like more kind of an encompassing mini coming out of the Return of Bruce Wayne stuff that Grant Morrison was doing. And he goes, so it's a mystery that's so big that it spans all these eras. And it's so big, it unites the Bat family to have to solve it. And it's called Gates of Gotham. And I was like, that's fucking awesome. I was like, what's the mystery? And he's like, that's what I'm calling you about. And I'm like, oh, okay. He goes, yeah, and we actually have to solicit and announce it in 2 days. So if you can figure that out and we can get a cover now, that would be great. And so it literally was going home that night and jumping on a call with Scott and Trevor and just figuring out like, okay, what is this? And the plan was, Mike was like, you're going to write this. He's like, Scott's going to be there for you, like on story and everything and kind of like, to oversee. And he's like, but this is the kind of thing that like internally, I think can really put you on people's radar as the type of project that like could start to kind of like elevate you and get open up more work and everything.
Right.
And so that's what it was. And then from there, it was like right place at the right time. The new 52 was hitting, and Scott kept telling me, he's like, oh, I think they're going to offer you something. I was like, Scott, I've never written a mini series, much less an ongoing. I'm literally writing 2 mini series, having never done it before, at the same time right now, which meant I was making all of the same mistakes twice on Supreme Power and Gates of Gotham.
Right.
And then they offered me Nightwing, Deathstroke, and then that turned into Nightwing like a week before New 52 was being announced. And then I was in the same situation. Now I'm writing 2 ongoing series at the same time, having not finished the 2 miniseries, making twice the mistakes on both. So
what would you projects. What would you say then were some of those mistakes that you felt that you were making here? Because again, like this is now,
yeah,
doing the one shots and things like that. You're writing the script and it's going to the artist, and I'm sure there's some collaboration here or there. But like Gates of Gotham really feels like there's a ton of collaboration going on here in a way that you maybe hadn't had up to this point, on top of all the other stuff that you're doing. So I'd love to hear maybe what you felt were some of those early mistakes.
Well, I think like on the miniseries front, I was definitely more comfortable with the idea of a miniseries structurally and pacing wise, because that felt I come out of a screenwriting background, so like films are close-ended stories, so I felt more comfortable with doing something like that. But that doesn't mean like your the pacing, things like that. Like the mistakes I was making were things that like you just haven't done it before, so you're laying track that sometimes you're not quite sure where it's actually going to go. Because this was one where there was no time, so you're trying to figure it out while you're doing it, and sure. I had a lot of anxiety just about like, I've never done this before, like I'm young, I'm trying to figure out how to do this at a professional level consistently. And you're still figuring out, I was 20 again, I was 24 at that point. It was like, I'm trying to figure out what my storytelling tenets are that I believe in and believe make for a good story. So it's stuff like that. And like, I would also say that like, there's some engine things, like, especially on an ongoing series, like just figuring out like where the important, like how to generate narrative, especially on an ongoing title that also feels thematically cohesive. That's a whole skill unto itself. And like,
sure.
So yeah, I mean, it's just, it was more than, I can't remember any like really specific things. Right. I remember some arguments, but I'm sure those were mistakes as well, honestly. But
sure,
yeah,
sure. So it's interesting. Like, look, and this is one of those things where, because you've been in the business for so long, it's going to be a thing where we do a part 2 where we probably go a little bit deeper into some of these things. But obviously, Nightwing is like, you get put on the main stage on a major, big corporate line-wide push, New 52, and you do a lot there to really like, reinvent the character in certain ways. But I think like, even like I said, even with Gates of Gotham, like these are aspects now of you adding to some to establish mythoses and histories and things like that in a way that I feel like a lot of folks like want to do, and I think have varying levels of success in doing so. So a lot of folks may just kind of keep some status quo. Like, these are big kind of swings that you're taking here.
Yeah.
Obviously it's a lot easier to look back and reflect and say like, oh yeah, that like the impact that I had doing that clearly, was a thing. Do you feel that in the moment when you're doing something like Nightwing on the stage like that?
Yeah, to some extent. Yeah. I mean, what I felt most of the time, I was, it was a very, very challenging time, the New 52, to be making books in. There was a lot of pressure. There was a lot of attention on things. But I don't even just mean externally, I mean internally, like at the company. Sure. So there were a lot of, and again, as I said, like being young, being a new writer, trying to figure out how to navigate all of this and navigate the politics. And it's just, there were a lot of cooks in the kitchen. There were editors that, they and I didn't necessarily see eye to eye all the time, and had different tastes and interests and or influences. And so just figuring out how to do this was hard in its own right. And then again, like in an era when there was a writer who was doing Nightwing first and it didn't work out. And so they offered me the book literally a week before they announced the New 52. And I had to go home that night and write a cold open. I basically wrote a 7-page cold open for Eddie Barrows to draw starting the next day. And I didn't even know what the book was yet. So you really are kind of like just hitting the ground, and like you don't have a choice other than to run. And with stuff like that, it's really tough, especially when you're starting out, to be able to spot like, oh, that choice there, that may seem interesting right now, but that's actually a story killer rather than a story generator. And so there was, most of the time, honestly, I just felt a lot of pressure. And he's also my all-time favorite character. So it's like, you don't want to, they give you the keys to the sports car, but then they're like, don't take it out of first gear. And you're also like, you're terrified of crashing it too. And so that said, though, there were things that Scott was doing in the Batman run in Court of Owls that I knew even then from like concept. Like Scott pitched me it. I mean, that Court of Owls was originally, and he's talked about this, Court of Owls was originally a follow-up to Black Mirror, and it was a story for Dick Grayson as Batman. Mm-hmm. And then the New 52 happened, and they asked him to make it a Bruce Wayne as Batman story. But those components of Nightwing, of Dick Grayson's like connection to it all, with what becomes the Talon, the Talon Killers and Haley Circus and all that, Scott still wanted to use all that, and so because he and I were really close, it was very easy to work with him and make sure I was integrating that stuff into Nightwing in a way that that would be additive. And it was stuff where, like, I remember like the first 7 issues of Nightwing were really hard because Scott had the reveal it was going to happen in Batman 7, which meant I couldn't do much in 1 through 6 that was like, if like it was, so it was hard. Like I said, it was hard to generate narrative in a way where you're like, and I would do it totally different now. But I remember in issue 8 feeling like when I ended up telling like the origin of like the Grayson family and the Grayson name. And that let me basically go back to like more like the Gates of Gotham stuff we were doing. And I felt really, really confident about that. And that was like the first time where I was like, yeah, okay, I know this works. And I do feel like this could be a thing that becomes something more. It could be additive to whatever extent people want it to be or enjoy it, you know? And now it's like, I don't know what they're doing in the next Batman movie, but like, I would love to see the Court of Owls, you know?
Right. Well,
and so,
but I think also,
you know,
but I think also too, what it feels like, you know, just as at this point, as an outsider kind of looking in the story that you're telling with Nightwing and, you know, now being able to look back on it, this is, you know, a lot of Dick stepping out of the Batman shadow in a way. And I feel like it's also, and it's you coming into your own really as a comic book writer. Which so then at this point, when does the idea of maybe you've done a bit of work for hire at this point, when does the creator owned, I want to do something that's mine start to crawl in?
It was pretty early on, honestly. Yeah. Like, you know, Jeff said something to me a couple years ago, because he was obviously there for all of this, and you know, so we've known each other for a long time in different degrees and through kind of different eras, I guess I would describe it as, and different dynamics. A couple years ago, though, he had said, he's like, you know, he's like, I never thought of you as like a Bendis or a Brubaker. Well, actually, it's not a good. He's not a good comp. Who would be the comp? I don't even mean to say that about Brian, because it doesn't. It makes it sound like it's something it's not. Basically, what he was saying is like, I always thought of you more as a Robert, like where you are like, he's like, you were very entrepreneurial, like you were doing this, you were doing all the DC stuff, but like you literally came in from your own film. Like it's in this world of, or this genre, but it's very much its own thing. And so he was, you know, he was happy to see what I was building out with Radiant Black and the Massiverse and everything. And then Black Market Narrative, our little, you know, collective here, because he felt like just from the time he knew me when I was an intern, it was like very clear that like I wanted to be doing original stuff. I'm not going to say no to playing with my favorite, you know, characters and toys, like who no one says no to Batman. That's the biggest lesson in comics. I have never met someone, James is probably the only person I've ever met who like walked away from Batman and had no qualms about it, you know. But you don't say no to Batman. And so it was like, yeah, I'm going to go do that. And then it kind of turned into this other thing. But so anyway, so it was very early on in the DC stuff that I was thinking about creator-owned stuff. I was always pursuing trying to make the League as like as a creator-owned book, and I don't think anyone introduced me to Eric. I think I emailed him cold, and just introduced myself and said like, hey, I'm writing, my name's Kyle Higgins and I'm writing Nightwing right now for DC, etc. And I'd love to talk about doing creator-owned stuff one day. And he wrote back like pretty quick. And then we just, we started talking, and we met in person at San Diego and had lunch, and then we just kept doing that over the years. And so it ended up being that Cowl became the first creator-owned thing I did, and it was at Image, and that was in 2014. But I think Eric and I were talking about stuff as far as we were talking about things as far back as probably 2012, maybe late 2012. But I would say about 2012. Yeah.
So what did you have to do to kind of catch yourself up on figuring out how a creator-owned book gets made, right? Like this is it's totally it's similar in so many ways, but so completely different in a number of very key areas.
Well, yeah, and it's also doing a creator-owned book at Image is a different experience than doing a creator-owned book at other publishers. And honestly, when I refer to at other publishers, this is an audio-only podcast, but I'm actually using air quotes around creator-owned in that instance, because that's kind of the fundamental difference. It's very rare. There are only a few publishers out there where you're truly doing creator-owned work, meaning the creators truly own it all. And Image is one of them. Image is also, in my opinion, it's my favorite. It's where I've done the majority of my work, but everything from the dynamic of how you do these books and how much kind of control you have, like that's something that was really, really attractive to me, even without having known what the other versions of that would be.
Sure.
It probably is because it just harkens back to like, making indie movies and things like that. Like you have to do everything. And there's great support at Image, and there's, great PR and marketing and production and all of those things. But like ultimately it's also on you as a creator to like figure out the vision, figure out how to make this book, but also like how to sell it to some extent. And, it's like, I don't know, it's very, it was cool. Like, I think I got it pretty early on. I do remember though, like,
your background a bit, I think helps you, definitely helps you out there in a way that, puts you at the advantage, let's say. In that
yeah,
sense.
I remember, but there's always there's always learning curves. And I remember like early on, I think on Cowl we had a little bit of an advance for each issue. And I remember like we were done with the issue and I didn't know what to do. And so I emailed Eric and I was like, hey, when does the advance like come on this issue? And he's like, did you invoice for it? I was like, do I have to invoice for it? And he's like, yeah, if you want to be paid, yes. I was like, oh, okay. Who do I send this to? Like, so there, stuff like that. And
sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Okay. Well, so then, but then also too creatively though, right? Like it's there's more invested in it, obviously. And you're working with, collaborators now in a way that aren't just, it's not just someone who's drawing a Batman book for you or Nightwing or whatever, right? And so what kind of went into, and what were some of, I guess, your favorite aspects of the development of Cowl that then you feel, kind of paid dividends as far as, the creative aspect of the work?
Yeah. It was huge. Like that book was huge for me in so many ways. I had been doing Nightwing and the DC stuff for about 3 years at that point, and my time was kind of coming to an end as far as like being considered for like mainline stuff in that way. And I'm pretty sure I'd been fired off Nightwing by that point, and which is a whole other story. But Eric was like I think it got leaked that I was off Nightwing, or maybe it wasn't leaked. Maybe it was, no, that's what it was. DC asked me to write a letter that I was leaving Nightwing. And I was like, but nice. I'm not leaving Nightwing. They're like, but, you should write a letter, and that you are. And so I wrote something, and I'm actually like, it ended up helping me crystallize like and like come to terms with my own feelings about it all, the experience as well as the character and everything else. Mm-hmm. And I scheduled it to go live one morning, and I think we were already doing Cowl at that point and working on it, which was a fun little, like, kind of came out of nowhere. Like, Eric and I had been talking about some other projects at San Diego months earlier, and he's like, what else is going on? I was like, well, we got this other little thing that, like, Rod Reese, who primarily is a colorist, I saw him doing paintings at New York. He colored majority of our Nightwing run, and they were incredible, and so we're going to just do this. And I pulled up some art because Rod had painted the first 7 pages of Cowl traditionally, and Eric zoomed in on them on my phone. He's like, whoa. And he's like looking at it. He's like, well, where is this going to be? And I'm like, well, we're just like going to self-publish it. And Rod wants to do it in Brazil first. And so then I figure we'll just see if anyone in the US might be interested. Cause I'm thinking it's a superhero thing. Like there's so many, like creator on superhero, like that's really tricky. Like even with Rod's very different style, which was important to us, I was like, there's, I didn't think there was a huge market for it. And Eric's like, well, I'm interested. I'm like, really? Oh, you want to do this? Like, I mean, I would kill to do this. And that ended up becoming the first one. And so I was like going to a meeting, I think, with like David Hyde, who ended up helping us out on marketing for the launch of Cowl. And I had scheduled this letter to go out about Nightwing, and I turned off all my notifications. Like I didn't want to see anything. I didn't want to look at it. And so I think Bleeding Cool reported on it or whatever happened. And I get an email from Eric that was like, well, I'm not going to say what it said, but it was very supportive. I'll put it that way. It was short and very supportive. And so I basically like then just pivoted all of my energy and focus into this thing that I loved already and had been working on in some way, shape, or form since I was 20 years old when I came up with the idea for the league. And I think that process of getting in there and figuring out, okay, I know how books are made now at DC. There are things about that I like, and there are things that I think I would do differently, even just from a process standpoint. And so we got to try those all out on Cowl. And the other thing we did on Cowl, it was so liberating and freeing creatively. There's an issue we did in between arcs, issue number 6, where we designed it to be an in-universe comic. And it's like an issue of the book. It's like our idea for it was like, this issue is the origin of the Grey Raven of Jeffrey Warner's, mantle. But it's like if Jeffrey Warner licensed his story to like a Stan Lee and Jack Kirby of that time to do. It's a glossy, almost kind of like, what's the term? Propaganda comic in some ways.
Sure.
But we did it with like in the style. It was actually Elsa Chartier's first work. Like it was her first book. We hired her to draw it, and then Rod colored it with all sorts of halftone and everything, and makes it feel old. And then Jen Abrahamian did all these advertisements that were advertisements for other Image books, but in the style of like 60s ads. And then we also had ads for like fake products from the world that like it was pretty cool. And at the end of it, we had like a clip out that you could cut and send in to get a Cowl patch, which we did for real. And we also announced at the end doing an original jazz album that again was like in universe. It'd be like if somebody like Miles Davis doing the Jack Johnson sessions, which was tied to the film. It was kind of like that. It's like the Cowl sessions were like someone doing a concept jazz album based on the characters and the things actually happening in world. And so then we announced like, no, we're actually doing that. And Joe Clark, who now does Radiant Black and Deep Cuts with us or with me, Joe's an amazing composer. He scored the league. We did a fully original jazz album that we put out through Bear McCreary's record label, Sparks and Shadows. So I look at all that stuff as like, oh, I mean, that's where it all kind of started, especially for like everything we do now on Radiant Black and the Massiverse and all this kind of like multimedia stuff. Because it all comes back down to like what gets us excited and what makes us feel immersed and immersion, because that's where the magic comes from for me, because that's what made me fall in love with all this stuff growing up. And so I want to try to capture that in my own way and do the things that, are in the spirit of what made me love superheroes and comics in the first place.
Right. I love that. So obviously Cowl is not, there's a few things in between Cowl and getting to the start of the Massiverse. I will, like I said, we could spend an entire podcast just talking about your time on Power Rangers, but I really just kind of want to distill it down to this one thing, and like I said, we'll come back to it on another time. You built a house that is still being lived in a sense, and for you, coming in, you've told the story of how you've come to how you came to the book a whole bunch. But how much of, I guess, what your goal was for that book was at the start versus what you kind of did along the way, and in that, has that helped form how you approach certain things creatively now, kind of going forward? Because I feel like there's a lot going on there where you come into an IP, but you make it very different. This is like the Power Rangers book, and you said was a goal of yours was not to make it just episodes of the TV show, lost episodes of the show, and so there's a lot there. And so I know we're going to only spend so much time on it, but I'd love to hear a bit about that and how it's just kind of helped inform.
Yeah, I mean, I think somebody told me once, I didn't actually hear Jonathan say this himself, but someone told me that Jonathan Hickman's thing about like these characters and Marvel characters, DC characters, etc., is like we are stewards of these characters when we work on them and these brands, these properties. Mm-hmm. And I very much kind of take that to heart. And so with Power Rangers, I used to describe what I was doing as like, I wasn't trying to write the book as I remembered the show.
Sure.
I was trying to write it as I remembered it making me feel. Mm-hmm. And so it's something where it's like, how do you capture that, the spirit of what makes the property work? And there are certain things you can push in different directions, especially to like, maybe contemporize some things. But then there are other things that like, sure, you might not do them now in this day and age, but maybe they're really important to, the core of it all. And so it's like, don't get rid of stuff just because it's not how you would do it now, And so figuring out where those things are and which things are those and which ones are vestigial and you can kind of, push away. I think that's it's a matter of taste, but it's also kind of like what we're hired to do. Like that's the job. Like we are a filter that we are, whether you like what we do or not as creators, like we are being hired or asked to apply our filter on the world, on media, on properties to, do something that is new, but also in the spirit of what came before, or, it depends on what the job is. I would say though that like, again, like Power Rangers was a really, really important book for me and for my life. Like not only creatively, but personally as well. And it was coming on the heels again of like my time at DC wrapping up. And, I had done a big run on Batman Beyond as well, but it was like a digital first. So it was kind of like a sectioned off thing. And that and Power Rangers were the two things where it was like, okay, this is what it can be like when you're in the right situation and you're the right fit for something, and the people also behind it believe in you.
Right.
And in particular with Power Rangers, then I feel like I took what I was doing on Batman Beyond, and then I was able to like elevate and grow. I was able to continue to mature with some of the things I was doing on Batman Beyond than with Power Rangers. And Power Rangers as a brand had never really had something like what we were doing in comics. I also met some people during it that are still work with me to this day, and are like core parts of the Massiverse. So Michael Basudel, who edits and designs all our books, and Matt Groom, who writes Inferno Girl Red, as well as, you know, all our Supermassives with us. And he and I co-write together the Ultraman books at Marvel. And we've got they just announced we're doing like a Spider-Verse, Venomverse thing together as well. Those guys ran a Power Rangers podcast, and I did an early interview with them and really liked them. And I was trying to get a sense of like the fandom and what it was like, what I was stepping into. And I'd always had this idea, and I love director's commentaries, especially on like, you know, Blu-rays and DVDs and everything especially from back in the day, because they don't really do them as much now. And I always thought it'd be really cool to do kind of like a director's commentary on a comic, like a monthly comic, to talk about it, you know, the release that just comes out. And so I asked them if they'd want to do something like that, and they did. And through that friendship, I feel like it was like very therapeutic, and like just very healthy for me to grow as a creator. And it was both because, I mean, the one thing is like what people don't know, like when you're in those worlds and you're working like predominantly with like say Marvel or DC characters, and you're like in that kind of like stable of writers, like when you're not in that stable anymore, but all your friends still are, it can be hard, because you're very happy for your friends, but it's also like you feel a little bit lost, or you feel like a bit of an outsider, you know, when editorial is not interested in you, but they're interested in everyone else. So it ended up being something where it was like doing Rangers and like meeting Matt and Michael and us just talking every day, like over Google Chat and then podcasts, etc., and just talking about story and talking about things that excited us, and like realizing, discovering like these guys are amazing. Like Matt's an incredible writer, Michael's an incredible designer, and his great story instincts. It like helped me find my people a little bit, you know? Yeah. And then it becomes that thing of like, well, I don't want to be a part of any club that doesn't want me, you know, or wait, what? No, that's not the saying. I don't want to be a part of a club that wants me. No, okay, this doesn't apply. Just ditch that altogether. Sure. Basically, it meant like, let me go build my fiefdom. And with the creators and the people that I can do, that get excited about the same things I get excited about. Right. And the other thing that happened in all of that was I feel like, I mean, I just grew as a writer, and I became much more comfortable with two things, optimism and ambiguity. And I think ambiguity as a writer is important, because I think it's important to know when things need to be crystallized and need to be spelled out. And I think it's important to also know when some things don't need to be and can be left more open to interpretation. And because if you're trying to make everything crystal clear, you can be really on the nose with stuff in ways that end up kind of undercutting what the point of what you were trying to explore and say as a writer actually was. Mm-hmm. The optimism part comes out of probably just getting a little older. And I feel like a lot of writers, when you're younger, it's like you are so insecure and you want to be taken seriously and you want your work to be taken seriously. So you're like, it's got to be edgy. It's got to be real. It's got to be about the human condition. All those things are true. All those things can factor in. But like, you know, people also like to laugh. People like to smile. Like people like to be reminded that there are really good things in life and not just about like the depravity of man, you know?
Right.
And I feel like Power Rangers, with its core tenets about like the strength of friendship and teamwork and the idea that we are better together, like that's something that really resonated with me and still does to this day. And so from there then, and with the support of, you know, Daphne Plebin and Bryce Carlson at Boom, and like Matt Levine and Alex Gaylor, like we got to do some really, really cool things. And then I also got to meet a lot of like the actors, Melissa Flores, who works with us now on the Massiverse stuff. She was our executive when she was at Saban on Power Rangers. And then Brian Casantini was the president. Those two could not have been more excited and supportive of everything we were doing. So much so that it's like, you know, Jason David Frank and I pitched this idea of doing a live action promo trailer for Shattered Grid. And then we went and made it. They let us go do it. We went and made it. I mean, Jason paid for the majority of it. And it was something that we were then able to put out, and like I directed it, I wrote it and produced it with him. And it's just like Marvel or DC would never let you do that in a million years, you know?
Yeah. Right.
They wouldn't even know what department to send you to try to do that. Okay. And so, you know, and then from there, like they asked me to write the video game. So I wrote the video game and then I voice directed it. And so again, it's all these things where I love being a writer. I love writing comics, but I also love doing other things. And a lot of times in these industries, we pigeonhole, and we don't, you know, we don't want to see what someone can do or be. We only want to look at them based on what they've already done.
Right.
And we all have navigated that at different times. So it was really it was really important and significant. And then coming off of that, obviously to build what we're doing now, it's like you see what the trajectory, like how A kind of leads to B.
So let's talk about we have gotten to Radiant Black. This is a book.
An hour into this, we're now.
It's all good.
I can ramble. I know.
This is a book that immediately sends a message because it has such a strong visual identity, right? There is so much about it that it stands out in a number of different ways. This is a bit of a nerdy question because I love talking about this kind of stuff, but like, how long did it take for you to land just on the Radiant logo and the symbol? Because like that to
was
me, really, you know, in the black hole of it all, really kind of sucks and brings it all in together, that everything else then gets to kind of get built around.
That was pretty quick, honestly.
Really?
It was pretty fast. Yeah. So when I was coming off Power Rangers, there had been an opportunity. We were developing, Jason and I were working on this thing with Saban about doing like a live action, like a digital series set in the world of like the comics and like the coinless stuff. And then Hasbro bought the brand overnight and everything got put on hold and then ultimately didn't move forward. I started playing around with this idea of doing something like on my own that was like kind of a post-dystopian kind of, you know, fiefdom cities, like Blade Runner type cities and like a Mad Max kind of world. And then, you know, very quickly it was like, you know, I don't think like no one's going to buy this like as a digital series. Like this is going to cost so much money. It's an original thing. Like it's not going to make sense. So I started thinking about instead maybe trying to do something as a comic in this kind of space. And I had the name. I knew that the iconography that was going to be kind of like our MacGuffin was a miniature black hole, because I just really liked the idea of that. And I also liked the idea that, like, I might be totally wrong on this now, I've realized, but like if you look at it from any direction, it would basically look flat.
Sure.
You know? And so I was like, on camera, it's like, oh, that could actually be like a really eerie thing. That could be cool. And I had the name Radiant Black. And I'm not usually good. I've gotten better, but I'm not usually good at naming things. So I was like, okay, I love that title. I love the iconography, and the term radiant also is there's some cosmology terms with radiant. And so it's like, okay, like this could be cool. And so when Eric offered like, hey, do you want to build like an original superhero, like a contemporary thing, it kind of reframed everything for me. And so I just took that miniature black hole and the name Radiant Black and then built something entirely new, whole cloth. And Ryan Parrott said this to me over a decade ago, and he was right, but he was wrong. Probably like 90% of a new character working is like a hero or a villain is the design. And he's 100% right, but he's wrong that I think the percentage is actually higher. I think it's like 95 to 98% of a new character working is that design, is the suit.
Sure.
And so when Marcelo and I met, I mean, Marcelo was already coloring the Self-Made book that we did at Image that Matt Groom wrote and Eduardo Ferragato drew. And Marcelo had been coloring Power Ranger stuff as well because Daphne stole them. And so when I was putting this together, Eduardo was like, you should really talk to Marcelo. He draws as well, and he loves Sentai. And I was like, really? Okay. So Marcelo and I started talking, and we started just trying some things, and he took some swings at designs, and it was really it was like the second pass, maybe the third, where it was like, that's it. That's literally the character. That's the guy. And then we didn't have the symbol on his chest. And so then it was like a series of like maybe 3 or 4 messages back and forth about like, well, how do we do a graphic representation of a black hole? And coming out of, like the movie Interstellar and all of the new kind of visual language of black holes and what they had been, what Kip Thorne helped everyone realize is how they would be how they would look, or in the visualization. It's like that informed us. And so Marcelo did this very like graphic representation of that idea, and it's like, and it sits perfectly on the chest, and it's like that's the character. And I remember showing it to Declan Shalvey one night, and he was like, he loved it, and he was so complimentary, and he's like, oh my, he's like, this is great. He's like, let me show you. And he held it up on his phone, and he's like, and he pulled it back, and he's like, it reads from 6 feet away. It reads at an inch tall from 6 feet away. That's how like you've got it. Like it reduced down so well, very clean. Right. Fair guy. Eduardo describes the design as like he's like the iPhone of superheroes, like that. Very sleek, very contemporary, kind of look, which I love.
Yeah, that's awesome. All right, so let's talk a bit about the genesis of Radiant Black, because up until this point, you had done a number of other Image books. You mentioned Self-Made, and you had done the Dead Hand, and is because you had done so much work for hire superhero stuff. Was a superhero creator-owned thing? Like, was that even on kind of your radar until, maybe you had that conversation with Eric about it? Or,
I mean, honestly, no, because it's not something that I ever thought there would be a market for. Mm-hmm. And I said that to Eric when he first, proposed the idea, and he said, I think there could be. And he kind of walked me through Spawn as a case study, and like where Spawn's numbers were at and historically and everything. And he's like, I think for the right thing, there really could be. And it felt like once I started thinking about it, it was like, oh yeah, I have to do this. And another thing that, Eric had mentioned at one point that Robert liked to say was that you can't pick your hits. And that always kind of stuck with me as well. Mm-hmm. And as I was building this and looking at kind of how to do it, I was just talking about pigeonholing a little while ago. The joke I make now, and I think there's a lot of truth to it, though. The only difference between a pigeonhole and a brand is if you're making enough money. And so I was looking at, like, because I think when Brevoort asked me to do Ultraman, he gave the caveat. He's like,
you're the Sentai Toku guy.
He's like, I know this would kind of pigeonhole you a little bit as like the Tokusatsu guy, but, and I told Tom, I was like, Tom, I'm 35. Like, I'm fine being pigeonholed at this, like I've done enough. Like, I'm good. Like, and so the way I looked at it was like, okay, well, Power Rangers to Ultraman to Radiant Black creates a pattern with retailers, potentially, where it's like, oh, the guy who launched and did all the first couple years of the Power Ranger stuff, now doing it with Marvel and Ultraman in the same kind of genre space, and now, oh, here's the creator-owned version. And so I just decided, like, okay, with those kind of elements at play here, I want to do something really, really relatable, and something that it's not autobiographical. Like, the book's not about me, but there's a lot of me in the book. Sure. And I figured you know what, if I'm going to do that, this is the time to do it. This is the one to do it on. Because if this works, and I thought we had a shot, it's like, if this works, I also don't want this to be something that, I want it to be something that I can grow with and continue writing for years without feeling resentful that I have to write it. Which is maybe a weird thing to like be considering, because it's like, that's assuming it's going to work. But I also think you kind of have to, I have believed that every book I've ever taken on was going to work. You have to have that kind of level of like self-delusion to some extent, because that's what's going to get all of your passion into it. When it doesn't work, that's hard to shake off sometimes, but you have to get up the next day and it's like, okay, well then what's the next thing? So that's where it kind of, so no, it wasn't on my radar as a thing that I was really wanting to do until the offer was there and the opportunity. It was like, oh my God, this is what I've wanted to do without realizing it kind of my whole life.
Right. I mentioned in the intro to this, in that one of the things that I think you have become known for, in a sense, is your ability to world build, right? Every kind of time, superhero-wise, up to the Radiant Black point, the worlds existed. You added a lot to it. But what are some of the challenges in truly building the world from the ground up, right? Like, how many different iterations of Marshall do you go through to land on? Or is Marshall easier because he's a bit more Kyle than anything else? It's obviously, you said it's not autobiographical, but like is the Marshall part easier to get down, but like the supporting cast and where he is and what he comes into, what's that like?
I mean, there are aspects that are easier, but there are also aspects of Nathan that are easier than aspects of Marshall. I actually worried when I knew from like kind of day one we were gonna basically kill Nathan in issue 4. I mean, he comes back, but like we were gonna kill him in 4, and Marshall would take over. And I remember like after we did it, and then I was starting to write issue 5. I was genuinely worried, because I was like, can I do this? Like, is this guy just going to be like, he might be better as a supporting character, like as a bit character where, and the plan was, I knew what the plan for the next 2 years was. And it's like, well, I've really put myself in a corner. Like, we're doing this. It's just do I like skill wise, like, can I do this? Can I pull this off without him becoming just like super one note and annoying? And so we dug into him more, and those concerns were then assuaged, so much so that when we brought Nathan back, then I was like, shoot, do I remember how to do this? But I think like as far as the world building goes, I like to look at world building. Especially on a creator-owned book where you're starting. Like, every choice is important and foundational. And I like to think of it as like every choice you make on a creator-owned thing, is like a pin in a tumbler lock, and where the book is set, when it's set, what the core concept is, what the powers are in this case, what the powers, how they work with other characters or other powers, all of those things are fundamental choices where you have to get every one of those choices right, so that if there are pins in a tumbler lock, so that the pins all pop up, and then you can actually open the lock. Right now, you might get one of them wrong, and you can brute force still get the lock to open, right? But you might not then realize that it's broken for 6 months or 12 months. And so there is a lot of significance, I feel like, about making sure that you nail the foundational elements, so that you are, as I was talking about earlier, like on Nightwing and other things, so that you're actually generating interesting and natural story paths for the future, as opposed to actually killing story paths without even realizing it sometimes. So that's something that I've gotten, I feel like I've gotten pretty good at. Like, it's something I really take a lot of stock, put a lot of stock into, and whether it's my own books or the other books that I like creative direct now, It's been really cool to like have to figure out how to articulate what and why sometimes I feel like something is working or is not working. And so on Radiant Black, I would say that it was actually, I don't want to say easy, but I think that we had our process kind of figured out by that point, and we had enough checks and balances between Marcelo and I, but Michael's like very key in all of this, and he's very much like the sense check on everything, and he has great ideas, and so, yeah.
One of the things that I think resonates really well with readers of this book, in a way that books like Invincible or Spider-Man have, is just how human the book is with your characters, because you tackle mental health, you tackle financial problems, and challenges of adulthood and things like that. Feels all of that stuff has to be just as important as the who do they punch of it as well. And so what have you learned about some of your characters as you've gone along the way that maybe you didn't know when you started?
Oh, that's an interesting question. That's a great question. I think that I learned. I mean, I learned what it's like. I learned what growth actually is for a character, and it's not big moves. It's not big seismic changes. It's often little things, and it takes a bunch of them before a character really starts to progress. And so like there are things with Marshall, especially like in issue 10, where he, during that big, basically turns into like an existential, it's the most expensive therapy session of all time. It's in blacklight. It's like this existential, sequence where he ends up getting reduced down into like Robert Crumb gestural drawings as he's admitting like that he hates himself. Okay, like that's a valuable realization, but just to know that doesn't, it's like, but what are you going to do with that? Right. And in the book, then he doesn't do much with that for a little bit of time. And I think that there was a period where I was looking at it and I was like, okay, so he knows that. So is he going to change? Like, can people really change? I mean, that's kind of like the core thematic idea of the entire Catalyst War is, can people actually change? And, or is it all superficial? Mm-hmm. And I think that, I do think that people can, but I also believe what Marshall says at the end of the Catalyst War, which is that, they don't change by themselves. Mm-hmm. And I think that learning and realizing that about Marshall as well as Nathan, and seeing the way that even in his frustrations with Marshall has made Nathan a better person and has been able to grow in ways that I don't think are like a super linear, like I think it's a bit more natural. It's a bit more how life really is. Mm-hmm. And I think that's probably what I don't know. I've learned more about these guys through their relationship with each other than even I was to some extent expecting. And I've learned, I think I've learned more nuances and complexity about each that, than where we started.
That's awesome. You mentioned the blacklight stuff, right? You have done, going back to the, this is being creator owned and all that, like you get to do a bunch of really cool, wild and crazy things. You have done a number of wild and crazy things on this book. I have to imagine that just kind of comes down to things where you're just like, well, what about this? Because I think that's kind of the experimental adventurer I think you are. What, in putting all that together, right? Mm-hmm. What has surprised you about maybe the fan reaction to some of that stuff? Because this is not stuff that they're getting from an issue of Batman or right. anything else, right? This is what feels like a singularly one-of-a-kind experience that I know you have been very focused on building, whether it's with Radiant Black or No One or whatever, to really take the world that you're building in the book and grow it beyond the book.
Right.
And so the fan reaction obviously is, I imagine, has to play a role in making some of the decisions, but mm-hmm. As you're piecing those together, what maybe, instead of your reaction to the fan reaction, what have you learned there in terms of what maybe works and what doesn't, and what would you like to potentially do more of?
Yeah, well, we love the immersiveness. We love the immersiveness, and we love that I love that we have been able to build a book and, a universe here that affords that type of immersiveness. It feels now kind of like a part of the DNA of the Massiverse, and that we are going to do things that really kind of push the boundaries on what comic books can be, and what storytelling in comic books and what a storytelling in a superhero universe can be. I think the biggest thing that I've learned, the reaction's been awesome. Like, right. When we did the Secret, short film, the animated short film with Will Friedle voicing Radiant Black, and by the way, all the actors playing the Cowl characters in that short, those are the actors from my film, The League, who came back 15 years later to voice these characters now in this in-universe animated, short. The reaction to that, because again, the film was it was a surprise. So it was just in a QR code in the book, and it's the film that the YouTubers in the book were making. It's and then we actually did it. Mm-hmm. The reaction to that kind of stuff is it makes it all worth it, because right. people realize holy cow, no one's doing this kind of thing. And the level of the level of immersion that it creates is something that I love. I think that the biggest thing I've learned though is it's one thing to do something really cool, and even to execute it really well. It's another thing to make sure the readers and retailers understand it so that they can actually engage with it. Mm-hmm. And I think that's one of the risks of doing stuff that's outside the box is you also have to make sure you're communicating the necessary points, because otherwise doing all the cool stuff is kind of for naught. If no one knows you did it or no one understands what you've done, then it doesn't matter how cool it is. And I think that's probably the biggest lesson with some of the stuff is figuring out how to be better communicators with some of the stuff, so that I think more people can appreciate what we get excited about and think is really right. cool, without it being alienating to others.
Mm-hmm. Love that. All right, so let's play catch up on the book a little bit. So far in the series, you've had the opportunity to launch the series. You have introduced the expanded cast of characters that we mentioned kind of here and there, and then mm-hmm. you've just recently basically threw a universe event, and we are now through all of that. Which again, mm-hmm. right, are all steps and hurdles kind of in their own way. And so before I get to the process aspect of it, let's for listeners who maybe haven't caught up or need the refresher, let's there, and we'll do some salesy stuff here too. There are plenty of there's ways for you to be able to catch up on what Kyle is doing and going to be starting in February of 2025. There is a story so far book that you can get available on Kyle's site, where radiant.black/catch up. We'll put that link in the show notes for you to jump in there and check it out. But Kyle, why don't you let's talk a little bit about the story. I know you're well practiced at this part of it for sure. And then we can kind of talk about what lies ahead for
the story of like the concept of the book story or
yeah. Let's do concept of the book, and then basically where we are now as we head into the rebuild era of Radio.
Yeah. So, for anyone who doesn't know what the series is, we like to describe it as a very contemporary superhero book about these two disillusioned millennial best friends who are navigating failed dreams and credit card debt with the help of miniature black holes and these giant existential robots. Can't forget about the robots. And it's something where if you like Power Rangers, I joke that it's like Power Rangers with adult problems. But I think there's a lot of DNA in there as well of things like Invincible, and Robert was kind enough to comp it to Invincible when it first came out. We've spent the last several years telling this story between these two best friends as they're also navigating complications in their own friendship and relationship as it relates to, unfulfilled dreams and potential and the way they thought the world was going to be and the way it really has turned out to be. And by the end of the third year or the end of the second year, there was a big choice to make. And what that choice was that these two characters had actually traded off the powers back and forth over the first 2 years. But that wasn't going to be possible anymore. And so they had to decide which one of them was going to be Radiant Black permanently for, going forward and for kind of like the rest of their lives. And so we left that as a fan vote. And we then put out in issue 25, which also kicked off the start of the Catalyst War, our 6-part big event where the alien beings in the Machine Empire, where these powers come from, are coming to Earth to take them back, and ultimately to challenge Radiant Black for kind of like not only the fate of this like ideological new way versus the old way. It's kind of a free will versus fate kind of thing, but also ultimately for how Earth is going to end up in all of this, and if it's going to be subjugated as a part of this Catalyst Empire, or kind of go on its own. And so we made both endings. We made the ending where the characters chose Nathan to be Radiant Black, and we made the ending where the characters chose Marshall to be Radiant Black. And then we put out those two endings under the A cover and the variant B cover, and we let that be a surprise. I reached out to a lot of retailers ahead of time to let them know, like, hey, this is this crazy thing we're doing. And then we announced that actually is the secret and the core of the event, was that for the next 6 releases, we were actually continuing the diverging timelines and making 2 different comic books for every release with 2 different scripts and 2 different art teams following these 2 timelines as they go like this, each timeline following a different character's Radiant Black. And then it all stitched back together in issue 30 and issue 30.5, which came out in October to wrap up the Catalyst War. And at the end of that issue, the final Radiant Black is Marshall Ward, who he is the winner of the vote, the fan vote that determined it all. So now going forward, starting with issue 31 of Radiant Black, we are kicking off what we're calling our rebuild era. So this is not only applicable to Radiant Black, but it also is applicable to Rogue Sun and kind of our approach on the Massiverse for 2025 in general, which is, all new era, big new jumping on point, We're back on time and monthly. Radiant Black's down to one title. It's just one book every month now. And in addition to the rebuild, applying kind of thematically to our approach with the books, and again, trying to bring in and welcome in new readers and make the prior volumes and stories really easy to find and catch up on. It also applies more directly with the events of Radiant Black and this new status quo as we move forward. So as Marshall has become the permanent Radiant Black, he is now aware of what went horribly wrong in the other timeline, the timeline where he was Radiant Black. That timeline no longer exists. But our Marshall saw all that. And so he is trying to level up and become the type of hero and person that the people who have granted him, specifically Nathan, left him these responsibilities and gave him these powers now. He doesn't want to let them down. And he also doesn't want to let happen here what happened over there. The problem is a lot of people have thoughts and feelings about what just went down with this machine empire and this kind of invasion, as well as what Radiant Black was doing during all of it and his part in it. And there might be some theories, Jim. There might be some theories that head into conspiracy territory. Some of them might be right. Most of them are not. But what that ends up eliciting and sparking within the larger world, and specifically Chicago, as it's trying to literally rebuild itself post this event. Sorry, I have a very needy cat. How that applies to Chicago as they're trying to start the rebuild process, including there's still two giant 110-foot tall, mecha robot carcasses, laying across State Street that they can't figure out how to dismantle, There's also the topic of what is the future of Chicago going to look like, and the world here, really. Mm-hmm. Coming out of this huge event, similar to something honestly, thematically, similar to the pandemic and us coming out of this thing that just rocked all of our lives and what we thought about the world, and we're all a little different as a result, and it's taken some time for us to come back. It's similar here. Mm-hmm. There's also been a proliferation of technology and weapons that have been in the book for all this time. These weapons actually charge by being near the miniature black holes. And so it's become open source, and so kind of anyone can build this stuff, but it's really kind of exploded coming out of the Catalyst War. Issue 31 takes place 5 months after the Catalyst War ended. And so in the way that COVID was kind of like a supercharger for the QR code and our understanding and acceptance of it as a society, for good and for bad, the Catalyst War is kind of honestly a catalyst for this proliferation of kind of the new age and kind of space weapon technology, as there's something of a almost a personal populist movement that is starting to happen. A populist protection movement, we'll call it that, as people are looking to not rely on others, and in particular any sort of greater powers, to keep them safe or protect them, and they're more looking to figure out how they can make sure that they can protect themselves. Mm-hmm. And the types of group think that's going to come out of that is also going to be really, really paramount to what I shouldn't say paramount. It's going to be a really interesting story and a big challenge for Radiant Black to try to combat, especially as so much of this group think, in addition to these weapons, is going to be targeted at him.
Right. Awesome.
So I wrote this little blurb, and it was basically Marshall may want to level up, but first he's going to need to keep the bottom from falling out. And so Radiant Black, the war is over and the rebuild starts here.
There you go. Wow, we love that. Look, this is one of those things where it's again, right? there is no shortage of superhero books out there, right? But this is one of those books that is more than that. And I know it's easy to say, and everyone says that, and whatever, but it's definitely one that if you haven't checked it out, you should. And you can read the first issue on Image's website and then catch up in a number of ways. Kyle, you've been so gracious with your time, so I'm going to ask you a set of questions before I let you go. It's something I've been doing with some folks at the end of these. The goal of this show has always been, from the beginning, is to get people to read more comics. And everyone's got their favorites, and so I'm going to ask you these two questions. One, what is the one comic that you recommend to someone who is looking for something new to read? And two, what would you recommend to someone? And look, it can be Radiant Black, it's fine. That you feel that is a book of yours that you have done that is the most representative of who Kyle Higgins is.
Well, the book that I would recommend that everyone needs to read is Stray Dogs by Tony Fleece and Trish Forstner and Tone Rodriguez and Brad Anderson. Is it Brad Anderson? I keep forgetting who colored that book. I'm sorry, Brad. It's I adore the book so much. It's one of Tony actually. I helped walk it to Image, and Tony actually pitched it to me at New York Comic Con one year. And I looked at him and I was like, that's the best pitch I've ever heard. Like, you have to make that. You're making that, right? You're going to do that. So highly recommend it to anyone who hasn't read it yet. It's basically like a Don Bluth animated film from the 80s, but like with more edge. And Trish trained under Don Bluth, actually. So the art really does look like, Disney and Don Bluth kind of esque animation cells. And then I guess the book of mine that I'd recommend, I mean, certainly Radiant Black, like, for sure. But the other big one, actually, that we don't talk about a ton, I'm trying to do more so of, because I'm so immensely proud of it. It came out last year. It's called Deep Cuts. And I guess, I don't know who would know this, but like I grew up a trumpet player. I played the trumpet till I was about 25, played through college and everything. And I'm a huge music nerd. This book is a look at the world of jazz, which is something that I love. And I wrote this with Joe Clark, who writes Radiant Black with me now. Joe and I went to high school together. We met playing in jazz bands in high school, and we became friends because the first X-Men movie was coming out on VHS and DVD, and I was going to go and pick it up after jazz band practice, and he's like, you like the X-Men? He's the one that introduced me to Alan Moore's work. Like, we go that far back. And in addition to being like an incredible comic book writer, Deep Cuts is actually the first book that Joe ever wrote on. So we wrote it together, and it was 6 issues long, and each issue was 48 pages, so prestige format. Each issue is also drawn by a different illustrator, and each issue takes place in a different decade of American history and jazz. And they are novellas, essentially, comic novellas. But there is a tapestry. There are through lines that carry across all 6 issues. And it ends up becoming one tapestry across a 60-year story, essentially, that explores different people around the world of music. They're all fictional. They're fictional people in these stories. This book is not an academic, like, stuffy look at jazz. It's a look at what it's like to be a musician or a music critic or an engineer. And at its core, it was really important to us to we wanted to tell a story that looked to recontextualize the ideas of success and failure. And so in the way that something can be created in one era and may not work, but you don't know as a creator the type of butterfly effect that it might have for other people. and what it could end up inspiring in its own right, that's success unto itself. And we're all just part of this greater, this greater web. And I think there's something really, Joe and I both feel like there's something very, very beautiful to that. So highly recommend it. We were nominated for an Eisner Award last year for it, for Best Anthology. And it's out now in collected edition with a gorgeous cover that Michael actually put together from snippets from throughout the book. It all feels very much like it's in that kind of Blue Note, design territory. If anyone listening to this is familiar with Blue Note. So yeah, that's the thing. Honestly, probably I'm the most proud of anything I've ever done. And then the other one I'd probably recommend is No One, because if you like the idea of any of this kind of like outside the box stuff that we're talking about, I think No One is probably it's the most ambitious version of any of that. In that it was a 10-issue series that we just put out in a collected edition. It collects all 10 issues. It's set in the Massive Verse. But what's really special about it is that while it follows this character, focuses on this character named No One, who's this like digital hacktivist that doxes these corrupt people in Pittsburgh. Then those people start getting killed in this kind of like ideological, killing movement that starts based on ideas of accountability. Two of the characters in the book are newspaper reporters who are talked into starting a podcast chronicling their investigation into this killing movement, but also the identity of No One. And so we actually made that podcast as a scripted audio series for every issue, with Rachel Lee Cook and Patton Oswalt voicing the two reporters, plus like Todd Stashwick and Yuri Lowenthal and Lauren Lester and Walter Jones and Adam MacArthur and just like this
immense amount of production going into this, which is just
killer cast. Yeah. And then in addition to that, we also made all the in-universe websites. So like when No One doxes these people, like you can actually go to his site if you know the right code to access it, which you learn from the book and the podcast. You can get into it. You can view all the files yourself. There's Unreal Engine videos that we were dropping. All of the newspaper articles, we made those for real as well. I hired a crime reporter from the Chicago Tribune and CNN named Peter Nikias, who I've read for years, to come in as a consultant. And he wrote all of these articles with us. And then at the end of it all, we released at San Diego Comic-Con 2 days after the final issue came out, where a box of footage shows up at the paper from the No One operation. We dropped a live action trailer that announced the feature film that we are making. Brian and I are writing it. I'm directing it. It'll be my first feature. And it's designed as a true crime superhero documentary, air quotes around documentary. So the idea is that, knock on wood, everyone who voices the characters on the audio series will play them in front of camera, and the film as a documentary will both adapt to the events of the comic and the audio series and the ARG, and it will continue the story. So it becomes one big multi-narrative. So that collection's out now, and we did something like 145 pages of like art revisions on it from the monthlies. We brought the costume designer on for the upcoming movie, and she helped us like rework a bunch of the fashion so that it'll all feel very immersive once the film comes out. And then there's something like 35 QR codes in the book. So all that cool extra material we did, and this actually speaks to what I was saying before about like, it's one thing to do it and do it hopefully well, but if no one knows about it, it doesn't really matter, right? So we wanted to make sure that we were really teaching readers how to engage with the story. And so like page 1 explains to readers, like, this is an interactive story, and like scan the QR codes, listen to the episodes, read the articles, like dive into the mystery for yourself. And so that's one that's out there right now that like probably took some years off my life making. Brian and I really killed ourselves on this one, and Geraldo Borges as well, our amazing artist partner on this. But yeah, I'd say those are probably the best ones that I recommend.
Well, and look, and this is one of those things where, again, we covered so much ground today, and there's still a ton of ground left to cover, in a sense. And so we'll have to do this again and go through some of your other stuff a bit more nitty gritty, because like I said, like there's a lot of great stuff in there. So Kyle, thank you again for spending the time today. We really do appreciate it. And so for everyone else out there listening, make sure you go and demand pre-orders and or pick up copies depending on when you listen to this. Radiant Black issue 31 in comic shops everywhere in February. Kyle, thanks again, man.
Awesome. Thank you, man. Talk to you soon.
Look, I told you this week's episode was going to be a beefy one, and boy, oh boy, was it. So much great stuff from Kyle. Thanks again for him spending so much time with me this week. Like I said, plenty of stuff to talk about, even more stuff that we have to talk about. So we will definitely do this again with him sometime down the line. Now, you know why we're here. This is the end of the show. You either are here because you have left a review, a 5-star review on iTunes or Spotify and want to know if you get a free sticker, or you like hearing the music at the end of the show. Either one is very important, and I would do it too. So we did get some reviews, and I want to read them. Because, again, right, your support means everything to me in doing this. So thank you so much. First review is from Big Mean Z. The headline, must listen. Wow. I just added this to my list of podcasts that I have to listen to. Amazing insight to the comics and into comics and comics industry. Can't wait until I get an alert that a new episode is out. Thank you so much. Another one from T-Lamp87. A great new and returning podcast focused on comic creators and their inspirations behind many books we love and enjoy. It is refreshing to take a deeper dive into the behind the scenes of the creative process and hear stories and influences that shaped the characters and stories that we have come to love. The relaxed vibe of the interviews makes you feel like you've been sitting with friends talking about comics. It's been a joy, and looking forward to hearing more. Man, thank you so much. What a nice one. And the last one is from The Real Brad Bell. Headline, The Image Comics of Podcasts. Creator and story focused, just like its namesake. An entertaining and informative podcast that serves as a backstage pass to the comic book medium. Thank you guys so much. Send an email to james@letstalkcomics.com with your address, and I will get a sticker out to you. They should be arriving to my house this week, and they will go out as soon as I have them. Now, we've got another, I mentioned earlier, like this was a show that was intended to come out twice a month because that's initially what my schedule looked like and how it looked like I was going to do this. Now it looks like it's getting closer to weekly, with the rare exception of this week where you're probably going to get 2 episodes because I've got another episode coming up cooking after this one that I think you guys are really going to love, with a writer who I adore, and her work is just phenomenal. And so stay tuned for that. And again, like I said, thank you. Thank you for listening, and I appreciate all the support wherever you are giving it, whether it's on social media or listening to it. I know some folks listen to it twice, which God bless you. I appreciate it. So that is it. I'm going to leave you with what I always leave you with. Go out and support your local comic book shop. Phenomenal books are hitting the stands each and every week. It is the result of hard work being done by so many people, not just the creators themselves, but the retailers who carry our books, to everyone working at publishers to make sure that these books, and distributors to make sure that these books can get out to you when they get it. I know there's a lot of shaking up going on in the business, but the one thing I think we can all kind of guarantee is that comics will find a way to you one way or another. And so go out, find something new to read, try something new. That is really that is how this business grows. It's really you, obviously, go read your Supermans and your Batmans and your Spider-Mans and all that. Those I love all of that stuff. Go, maybe if you're not a Green Lantern fan, pick up a Green Lantern book, or if you want to try something a little different, try a horror book of some sort, or try some cool sci-fi or anything else. If you've got the extra scratch to do it, just do it. It's broadening what you can read and experiencing what's out there is one of the best things about reading comics. So, as long as you keep reading them, we're going to keep talking about them. We'll catch you next week, folks.